The mahogany doors of the law firm closed, sealing her fate. While her greedy relatives inherited millions, the lawyer handed her a single, tarnished $1 bill. She broke down, utterly humiliated and defeated. But that single dollar wasn't an insult. It was the key to an empire they never knew existed. The boardroom of Gable and Harding, located on the 42nd floor of a pristine Chicago high-rise, was suffocatingly quiet. The only sound in the sprawling room was the rhythmic, hollow ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner, and the occasional sharp rustle of heavy parchment. Clara Donovan sat at the far end of the immense, polished oak table, feeling entirely out of place. Her worn, navy blue wool coat was tightly wrapped around her shoulders, a stark and glaring contrast to the surroundings, and to the people sitting opposite her. Across the table sat her aunt, Eleanor Kensington, draped in an immaculate white cashmere shawl and reeking of expensive, heavy perfume. Beside Eleanor was her son, Clara's cousin, Bradley, who spent the entire morning impatiently checking the face of his diamond-encrusted Rolex. They were the picture of inherited arrogance, waiting like vultures to pick clean the bones of Arthur Pendleton's massive estate. Arthur Pendleton had been a titan of industry, a man who built a fortune in logistics and real estate from the ground up. He was also Clara's grandfather. However, Clara's mother had been the black sheep of the family, disowned decades ago for marrying a high school English teacher instead of the wealthy heir Arthur had chosen for her. Clara had grown up far removed from the Pendleton wealth, watching her parents struggle, budget, and eventually succumb to the crushing weight of medical debt. It was only in the last 6 months of Arthur's life that Clara had finally met him. Hearing he was terminally ill and isolated in a sterile hospice suite, abandoned by Eleanor and Bradley, who found hospitals depressing, Clara had taken the bus across town every single evening after her shift at the diner. She hadn't gone for money. She went because she couldn't bear the thought of a man dying completely alone. They had shared quiet, profound conversations. Arthur had expressed deep regrets, and Clara had found a strange, belated comfort in the grandfather she never knew. When Arthur passed away, Clara was shocked to receive a formal summons to the reading of his will from Richard Gable, Arthur's formidable, decades-long personal attorney. A tiny spark of hope had ignited in Clara's chest. Her mother's small house was currently 2 months away from foreclosure. Clara didn't want millions. She just needed a lifeline. A few $1,000s would save her family from total ruin. Attorney Richard Gable, a stern man with iron-grey hair and piercing blue eyes, cleared his throat, adjusting his reading glasses as he broke the heavy silence. "We are gathered today to execute the final will and testament of Arthur Thomas Pendleton," Gable began, his voice resonant and devoid of emotion. Eleanor sat up straighter, a hungry gleam in her eyes. Bradley finally stopped looking at his watch. Gable read through the standard legalese before arriving at the distribution of assets. "To my eldest daughter, Eleanor Kensington, I leave the entirety of the Pendleton Logistics corporate holdings, as well as the primary estate in Lake Forest." Eleanor let out a long, satisfied exhale, a smug smile stretching across her face. She leaned back, shooting a brief, triumphant glance at Clara. "To my grandson, Bradley Kensington," Gable continued, "I leave the sum of $15 million held in the primary offshore trust, alongside the equity portfolio managed by Vanguard." Bradley pumped his fist subtly under the table, muttering a quiet "yes," before leaning over to whisper something in his mother's ear that made her chuckle softly. Clara's heart began to hammer against her ribs. The corporate holdings, the estates, the trusts, it was all gone. But surely Arthur had left a small cash reserve, just enough to help her pay the bank. She gripped the edge of the mahogany table, her knuckles turning white, waiting for her name. Gable paused. He looked up from the document, his eyes locking onto Clara for a fraction of a second before looking back down. The atmosphere in the room suddenly grew razor thin. And finally, Gable read, his voice slowing down deliberately. To my granddaughter, Clara Donovan. Clara held her breath. I leave the sum of exactly $1. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy, and crushing. Clara stared at the lawyer, her mind struggling to process the words. $1? It had to be a mistake, a typo. Perhaps he meant 1 million or 100,000. I'm sorry, Mr. Gable, Clara whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Could you repeat that? I leave the sum of exactly $1, Gable repeated, his face unreadable. He reached into his suit pocket, pulled out a single, physical $1 bill, and slid it across the long, polished table. It came to a stop right in front of Clara. Suddenly, a sharp, cruel bark of laughter shattered the quiet. It was Bradley. He didn't even try to hide it. He threw his head back and laughed aloud, while Eleanor pressed a manicured hand to her mouth to stifle her own giggles. Oh, Clara, Eleanor purred, her voice dripping with venomous pity. Did you really think that playing the devoted, weeping granddaughter for a few weeks was going to earn you a payday? Father wasn't a fool. He knew exactly what you were after. That's not true, Clara choked out, feeling a hot, prickling sensation behind her eyes. I didn't ask for anything. You just thought you could swoop in and cash out, Bradley interrupted, smirking. Well, enjoy your dollar. Don't spend it all in one place. Maybe you can buy a pack of gum on your bus ride back to the slums. The humiliation hit Clara like a physical blow to the stomach. It wasn't just the lack of money. It was the profound cruelty of the gesture. Arthur had deliberately written her into the will just to publicly insult her. He had taken her genuine affection, her late nights holding his frail hand, and reduced it to a joke for his greedy daughter and grandson to laugh at. The walls of the boardroom felt like they were closing in. Her vision blurred as hot tears spilled over her eyelashes. She didn't say another word. Clara stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. She snatched the dollar bill off the table, turned on her heel, and practically ran out of the room, leaving the echoing sound of her aunt and cousin's laughter behind her. Clara made it to the lobby before the dam finally broke. She pushed through the heavy glass revolving doors of the Gable and Harding building and stumbled out onto the freezing Chicago sidewalk. The icy wind whipped her hair across her face as she leaned against a concrete pillar, sobbing uncontrollably. She felt so incredibly stupid. She had believed Arthur when he told her he loved her, when he told her that meeting her was the only good thing to happen to him in his final years. It was all a lie. Now she had to go home and tell her mother that the bank was going to take the house. They were going to be on the street, and the man who could have prevented it with a stroke of a pen had chosen to humiliate her instead. Clara clutched the crumpled $1 bill in her fist, preparing to throw it into the nearest trash can when she heard the heavy doors open behind her. "Miss Donovan! Clara, wait!" Clara wiped her eyes furiously, turning to see Richard Gable rushing out onto the sidewalk. The stern, unreadable lawyer from the boardroom was gone. In his place was a man looking deeply urgent and frantic. He didn't bother putting on an overcoat despite the freezing temperature. "Leave me alone," Clara said, her voice hoarse and defensive. "Haven't I been humiliated enough for one day?" Gable closed the distance between them, looking around nervously to ensure they were alone. "Clara, please, you must listen to me. What happened up there? It was a performance, a necessary legal performance." Clara frowned, stepping back. "What are you talking about?" Gable sighed, catching his breath. Arthur knew exactly what Eleanor and Bradley are capable of. If he had left you a substantial sum of money in that will, or left you out entirely, Eleanor's lawyers would have immediately tied up the estate in probate court for the next 10 years. They would have claimed he was not of sound mind, or that you manipulated him. They would have bled you dry in legal fees until you surrendered. Clara stared at him, the tears freezing on her cheeks. In the state of Illinois, and in many jurisdictions, Gable explained, lowering his voice, leaving an heir exactly $1 is a deliberate legal maneuver. It proves to the court that the deceased did not forget the heir, but explicitly and intentionally chose to leave them that specific amount. It makes the will virtually impossible for Eleanor to contest on your behalf. By giving them the visible empire, he satiated their greed. They won't look any further. Look further for what? Clara asked, her voice trembling, though this time from confusion rather than grief. Gable reached inside his suit jacket and pulled out a thick, heavy envelope made of aged, dark parchment. It was sealed with red wax bearing the Pendleton crest. For this, Gable said, pressing the heavy envelope into her hands. This was not part of the probated estate. It never belonged to Arthur Pendleton. At least not on paper. It belongs to a blind trust that Arthur established 30 years ago under a different name. A trust that, as of his passing, now names you as the sole, incontestable beneficiary. Clara looked down at the envelope. It felt incredibly heavy. What is it? Everything, Gable said softly. The $1 was just the diversion. Arthur loved you, Clara. He told me you were the only one who saw him as a human being, not an ATM. He wanted to make sure you were taken care of in a way that Eleanor could never touch, never steal, and never ruin. Gable stepped back toward the doors of the high-rise. Open it when you are in private. Follow the instructions to the letter. And Clara, be careful. With that, the lawyer turned and walked back inside, leaving Clara alone on the freezing street, holding an envelope that seemed to hum with hidden weight. Clara didn't take the bus. She splurged the last of her cash on a cab, locking the doors as soon as she slid into the back seat. With shaking hands, she broke the red wax seal. Inside the envelope was a heavy, ornate brass key that looked like it belonged to a medieval church, and a thick stack of legal documents. On top of the documents was a handwritten letter on Arthur's personal stationery. My dearest Clara, if you are reading this, it means you survived the wolves in the boardroom. I am so sorry for the pain I caused you today. I had to make them believe they had won. Eleanor and Bradley are greedy, but they lack vision. They only see what is put directly in front of them. The companies and the Lake Forest estate are poisoned with debt, corporate espionage, and tax liabilities that Eleanor will now spend the rest of her life dealing with. I gave her the headache she so desperately craved. To you, I leave my true legacy. The papers attached are the deeds to the Blackwood Trust. Clara paused, remembering she wasn't supposed to read that name. She blinked, rereading the handwritten text. The papers attached are the deeds to the Oak Haven Trust. Attached is an address in the dense forests of the Berkshire Mountains in Massachusetts. Go there. Use the key. Everything inside is yours. I love you, my brave girl. Forgive an old man his theatrics. Grandfather. Clara lifted the final piece of paper. It was a property deed, completely paid off, listing her as the sole owner. Below it was a set of GPS coordinates and a vague address on a private road in Massachusetts. 2 days later, having borrowed a battered car from a friend, Clara found herself driving deep into the Berkshires. The GPS lost signal miles ago, and she was relying solely on the printed map Gable had included in the packet. The paved roads turned to gravel, and the gravel turned to a winding, overgrown dirt path shrouded by ancient, towering pine trees. She drove for what felt like hours, a creeping sense of doubt settling into her stomach. Had she misunderstood? Was this another trick? Just as she was about to turn the car around, the thick canopy of trees suddenly broke, revealing a massive, sprawling clearing overlooking a private, crystal-clear alpine lake. Clara slammed on the brakes, her jaw dropping. Rising from the edge of the water was not a cabin, not a normal house, but a breathtaking, Gilded Age mansion, constructed of pale stone and dark slate. It was an architectural masterpiece, complete with sprawling terraces, towering chimneys, and a massive wraparound driveway. It was perfectly maintained, pristine, and entirely hidden from the rest of the world. Clara slowly stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching under her boots. The silence here was peaceful, majestic. She walked up the grand stone steps to the massive oak double doors, her hand trembling as she pulled the heavy brass key from her pocket. She slid it into the lock. It turned with a satisfying, heavy click. Clara pushed the doors open, stepping into the grand foyer, completely unaware of the terrifying secrets and immense treasures that had been locked inside this house for decades, and unaware that someone else had already been looking for it. The air inside the Oakhaven mansion was cool and smelled faintly of lemon oil, old paper, and beeswax. Clara stood frozen in the grand foyer, her eyes tracing the sweeping double staircase that curled upward toward a magnificent stained glass skylight. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls from the vaulted ceilings, and priceless Persian rugs stretched across the gleaming mahogany floors. It wasn't just a house, it was a museum of unimaginable luxury. Yet, there was an eerie stillness to it. White linen dust covers draped over the furniture in the main living spaces gave the rooms the appearance of a crowded graveyard. Clara moved cautiously, her boots barely making a sound. She wandered through a massive formal dining room, a sunroom filled with wilted but still potted exotic ferns, and finally into a sprawling, two-story library. The walls were lined floor to ceiling with thousands of leather-bound books. Over the massive stone fireplace hung a breathtaking landscape painting that Clara, even with her limited knowledge of fine art, instantly recognized as the unmistakable, textured brushstrokes of Claude Monet. It was a masterpiece, hanging casually in a forgotten house in the woods. She walked over to the massive mahogany desk in the center of the library. Sitting squarely on the leather blotter was a sleek, modern tablet, a jarring contrast to the antique surroundings. Next to it was a small, handwritten note from Arthur. "Press your thumb to the screen, Clara. The system has already been programmed for you." Her heart pounded against her ribs. She pressed her trembling right thumb against the dark glass of the tablet. The screen illuminated instantly, flashing a green light, followed by a deep, mechanical grinding noise that seemed to reverberate from the very foundations of the house. Behind her, the massive stone fireplace, Monet painting and all, began to slowly pivot inward, revealing a hidden, brightly lit elevator shaft. Clara swallowed hard, stepping into the stainless steel car. There were no buttons, only a single mechanism that engaged the moment she stepped inside, taking her deep underground. When the doors finally slid open, Clara gasped. She wasn't looking at a basement. She was looking at a high-security subterranean facility. At the end of a short, concrete corridor stood a massive, circular steel door, easily 3 feet thick. She recognized the faded industrial logo etched into the brushed metal. Mosler Safe Company, the legendary manufacturer that had built the impenetrable vaults for the United States Gold Bullion Depository at Fort Knox. The vault door was slightly ajar, waiting for her. Clara pushed it open with all her body weight, stepping into a climate-controlled room that made her knees feel weak. The walls were lined with meticulously organized safe deposit boxes and reinforced shelving. On the left sat neat, towering stacks of certified gold bullion bars, gleaming dully under the LED lights. On the right were rows of sealed, climate-controlled glass cases housing what appeared to be rare historical artifacts, including an authentic, jewel-encrusted Fabergé egg and a pristine 17th-century Stradivarius violin. But the true revelation sat on a stainless steel table in the center of the room. It was a stack of dark blue folders bearing the crest of Coutts & Co., the exclusive private bank favored by the British royal family. Clara opened the top folder. It contained the financial truth of Arthur Pendleton's empire. As she read through the heavily documented bank statements and ledger entries, the genius of her grandfather's final revenge became brilliantly clear. The primary Pendleton Logistics Corporation, the massive company Eleanor had just inherited with such smug satisfaction, was secretly hollow. The ledgers revealed that Arthur had spent the last decade taking out astronomical, high-interest corporate loans against the company's assets, funneling the liquid cash into offshore, untraceable accounts before finally routing it into the Oakhaven Trust. He had deliberately bloated the company's value on paper while simultaneously drowning it in toxic debt and severe, impending IRS tax liabilities. Eleanor hadn't inherited an empire. She had inherited a sinking ship laced with financial dynamite. The moment she tried to access the corporate funds, the banks and the federal government would descend on her, seizing her personal assets, including the Lake Forest estate, to cover the catastrophic corporate debt. Arthur had given his greedy daughter exactly what she wanted: the crown. He just didn't tell her it was made of lead and laced with poison. And all the actual untainted wealth, totaling nearly $400 million in gold, art and liquid offshore accounts, was sitting right here in this vault, entirely legally owned by Clara Donovan. Tears of profound relief and awe streamed down Clara's face. Her mother's house was saved. They would never have to struggle, scrape, or beg ever again. But as Clara reached for the next folder, the silence of the subterranean vault was broken by a sound that made her blood run cold. It was the distinct, mechanical hum of the elevator descending. Someone else was in the house. Clara panicked. She looked around the vault for a weapon, grabbing a heavy brass paperweight from the table. She darted behind a towering shelving unit stacked with gold bullion, pressing her back against the cold steel, holding her breath. The elevator doors chimed and slid open. Heavy footsteps echoed down the concrete corridor. "I'm telling you, the GPS tracker led exactly here," a gruff, unfamiliar voice echoed. "Well, find her, Desmond. She has to be down here," another voice snapped. Clara clamped a hand over her mouth. It was Bradley. "Do you have any idea how much this place is worth, Mr. Kensington?" The man named Desmond, presumably a private investigator or a hired thug, asked, his voice dripping with awe as he stepped into the vault. "This is a Mosler setup. It costs millions just to build the door." "I don't care about the door. I care about what's inside," Bradley barked, storming into the room. Clara peeked through a small gap between the gold bars. Bradley looked unhinged. His expensive designer suit was wrinkled, his face red and sweaty. Clara's mind raced. How had they found her? The borrowed car. Bradley must have hired someone to put a tracker on her vehicle the moment she left the law firm in Chicago. They never believed the $1 inheritance story either. They were too paranoid, too greedy to let it go. "Look at this," Desmond said, whistling low as he approached the center table. "Coutts' private banking ledgers. Gold. It's all here. Your grandfather didn't just hide a little cash, Bradley. He hid the entire actual fortune. Bradley let out a ragged, furious laugh. That old senile bastard. He really thought he could give it all to that pathetic diner waitress, to Clara, after everything my mother and I did to manage his public image. Bradley violently swept the Coots folders off the table, sending papers fluttering everywhere. Find her, Desmond. She has the legal deeds. I want those deeds signed over to me today, or she doesn't leave this mountain. Clara's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was trapped in a subterranean vault with two desperate men. There was no cell service underground. No one knew she was here except Richard Gable, and he was hundreds of miles away in Chicago. She looked frantically around the vault. Her eyes landed on the massive Mosler vault door, then traveled along the thick steel frame to the control panel on the inside wall. Beside the panel was a heavy, red emergency lever marked Manual Override, Lockdown. Arthur hadn't just built a vault. He had built a panic room. Clara knew she only had one chance. She calculated the distance. 10 feet. "Mr. Kensington," Desmond said, walking toward the back of the vault, his footsteps drawing closer to Clara's hiding spot. "I think she's—" Clara didn't wait. She bolted from behind the shelves, sprinting toward the vault door. "Hey!" Desmond shouted, lunging forward. Bradley spun around, his eyes going wide with rage. "Clara! Grab her!" Clara hit the control panel with her shoulder, her hand desperately gripping the heavy red lever. Desmond was fast, his heavy boots pounding against the concrete floor. He reached out, his fingers grazing the fabric of her coat. With a scream of pure adrenaline, Clara yanked the heavy red lever downward with all her might. Instantly, a deafening alarm klaxon blared through the vault. Red emergency strobe lights began flashing, painting the room in harsh, disorienting bursts of crimson. The massive, 3-foot-thick steel door, activated by a pneumatic system, immediately began to swing shut on its heavy hinges. Clara threw herself backward, rolling out of the vault just as the immense steel door eclipsed the opening. Bradley and Desmond charged toward the exit, but the door was too fast, too heavy. It slammed shut with a concussive, earth-shaking boom that rattled Clara's teeth. The heavy, automated locking bolts slid into place with a series of loud, industrial clanks, sealing the vault completely. Clara scrambled to her feet, gasping for air. Through the thick bulletproof glass observation portal embedded in the center of the door, she could see Bradley pounding his fists uselessly against the steel, his face twisted in a silent scream of fury. Desmond was pacing frantically, yelling into his cell phone, realizing too late that there was zero signal inside a Mosler steel enclosure. They were trapped, buried alive in the very wealth they had tried to steal. Clara leaned against the cool concrete wall of the corridor, her whole body shaking as the adrenaline slowly began to recede. She walked back to the elevator, rode it up to the serene, quiet library, and picked up the landline phone sitting on Arthur's mahogany desk. It had a dial tone. Her first call was to Richard Gable. "Mr. Gable," Clara breathed, looking up at the Monet painting. "You need to send the state police to Oakhaven. I caught 2 intruders." The fallout was swift, brutal, and intensely public. When the local authorities, accompanied by an incredibly smug Richard Gable, arrived to open the vault, Bradley Kensington was arrested on the spot for trespassing, attempted grand larceny, and corporate espionage, as Desmond quickly turned state's evidence to save himself. But the true devastation fell upon Eleanor. Within 48 hours of the arrest, the financial news networks caught wind of the scandal. The SEC launched an immediate, catastrophic audit of Pendleton Logistics. The hidden debts, the tax evasion, the hollowed-out corporate structure that Arthur had meticulously engineered, all came crashing down onto Eleanor's shoulders. Because she had legally accepted the inheritance of the company, she was personally liable. The banks seized the Lake Forest estate, her luxury cars, and froze all her assets. She was left with absolutely nothing. 6 months later, Clara Donovan stood on the expansive stone terrace of Oak Haven, sipping a cup of cheap diner coffee as she watched the sun rise over her private lake. She hadn't changed much. She still wore her comfortable jeans and an oversized sweater, but her mother was now resting inside, completely cured of her ailments thanks to the world's best private doctors, and her childhood home was safely paid off. Clara had partnered with Sotheby's to quietly auction the Monet, using the staggering proceeds to establish the Arthur Pendleton Foundation, a massive philanthropic trust dedicated to wiping out medical debt for low-income families across the country. Arthur had been right. Eleanor and Bradley had only seen the dollar bill, blinded by their own towering arrogance. They had laughed at her, entirely unaware that the single, crumpled note was merely the admission ticket to a show where they were the tragic, ruined punchline, and the quiet, devoted granddaughter was the undisputed queen of the empire. If Clara's incredible journey from a humiliating $1 inheritance to outsmarting her greedy relatives kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button. Don't forget to share this thrilling story of poetic justice with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more real-life dramas, hidden secrets, and shocking twists. What would you do with a hidden mansion? Let us know in the comments below.